Welcome to Bytes and Bolts, a podcast where we seek to improve ourselves, our work, and the web industry as a whole. In this episode, we're going to be looking at false assumptions and how they play into our daily work, and how they play into our bias. False assumptions. Okay, so I'm going to explain a little bit of code here. Think about a JavaScript for loop. Start off with a variable. We define it as 0. We call that variable I. And then we loop through all of the users on the internet. And for each one of those users, we create our own array and we push ourselves to that array. Or think about it another way. For every user on the internet, we substitute ourselves, and that's our user base. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but as designers and developers, this is often our default mode of thought. If you're not a developer and you're kind of left scratching your head, just hang in there. We'll explain the code. It's okay. But there's a major fault in the way that we define who our users are. In fact, instead of considering the true users, we substitute ourselves for every one of our users. And it's tempting to think that everyone who uses a product is just like me. It's tempting to think that they understand me. We might even believe it's safe to assume that they think like me. They think like me? Whoa. Okay, when you put it in those terms, the problem becomes clearly evident. If we're not careful, our default assumptions can be dangerous. You can't fault us, though. I mean, we live our lives in our own skin every day. We think with our own brain 100% of the time. Our own perspective is all we know. Even if you talk to others and attempt to broaden your perspective, it's still being filtered and interpreted by a lifetime of our own understanding. Everything we see, hear, and do is absorbed into us. It doesn't overwrite our previous knowledge, it adds to it. Whether you believe in the nature or the nurture, our brains still operate in a pattern that is unique to us. You can group like-minded individuals together, but they're still not identical, and everyone is unique. Yeah, we know, John, everyone is a snowflake. There's no two that are alike. Okay, so maybe you do know that, but consciously, do you incorporate that knowledge into the various design layouts that you create and the endless lines of code that you write? This false assumption everyone is just like me can destroy a project before it ever gets off the ground. It can rip relationships apart and it can ruin a lifetime of achievement. But it's not the end. We can learn from it. Stop to evaluate how you think about the user for the project that you're working on. Are you envisioning yourself in the user's place? Kind of thinking like you in your own home, on your own Wi-Fi? In your favorite browser, at your stage of life, etc., etc. Sure, we can develop these personas that are best practices, and we can build use cases. We can perform user research and conduct endless hours of testing, and we should be doing those things. But it's not a substitute for people. Not just testers, but people. That's who we're designing and developing for. Over the past few weeks, I've been enjoying listening to the memoirs of Robin Olds. If you're not familiar with him, he was this legendary fighter pilot through several wars and eventually rose to high ranks in the military leadership. And as I listened to his personal perspective on wars and battles and these dogfights, the relationships he's had, challenges, and countless rebellious actions that he took, I was struck with the difference in perspective that he had. Could never fully come to understand the way that he thought and the reasoning behind the decisions that he made. Even in his own story, he related the decisions of others to his own perspective. Most notably, the change in perspective of his leadership. When Olds began his career, he saw the military highly organized and considerate of people, the troops, being involved and focused on winning wars for the sake of preserving our freedom. And by the time he had left, he had observed a dangerous shift to see the military as a sloppy brute force machine to achieve worthless goals. Even in the highest ranks of the military, perspective became a problem. As we consider what our perspective is, look around, ask others, and do your best to interact with people. This world is full of people, and these are the people that we are building the web for. And when foolish assumptions are in the driver's seat, it's a recipe for disaster. These assumptions are like an electrical arcing wire in the midst of spilled gasoline on the shop floor. The stakes are high, the consequences are great, and the fate of the web is on the chopping block. So, Start Your Shift asked, how have we observed bias in the web industry? And my answer is by the dangerous assumptions that we make every day. A bias is made up of assumptions that we are unwilling to evaluate. No assumption should be sacred. There's nothing that we should guard so closely that we are unwilling to evaluate it. If we are unwilling to inspect the assumptions of ourselves or the project, then we are boarding a train with no driver. It's imperative that we take time to consider the assumptions that make up our bias. Whether it's a bias about programming languages, connection speeds, user personas, or even color preferences, nothing is sacred. Consider them and ask others to help you to consider them. In my opinion, one of the biggest biased offenders is internet connection speed. In suburban America, we are spoiled with fiber optics and public Wi-Fi. We have it easy. And in my experience, it's the one that's most pervasive. It's everywhere. It's inside of our 2x ready images. It's inside our wasted lines of code, white space, excessive markup, and poor server configurations. It's a problem of gigabyte proportions, and it's costing everyone dollars. For your users, it's eating into their no longer unlimited data plans. It makes them want to give up, to close the tab, or to wait until later and then actually forget to come back and finish that transaction. For our clients, it's thrashing away at their transfer caps and costs. It's slowing down their servers. It's causing users to bail. It's lost profits. It's increased hardware costs, and it's even a threat to the crucial communication to their customers. As I began the journey of reworking my site, my first and primary goal was speed. I didn't want one unnecessary line of CSS. I chose not to include bulky JS libraries. I focused on saving my users time and money if they chose to visit my site. I admit it's still a journey and it's not perfect. And over time, I intend to continue evaluating the purpose and goals of my site. However, I wanted to decide to wage war on performance. And every line of code that I write, I consider the cost to the user versus the gain. I decided to love the people by serving them through the code that I wrote. At the end of the day, our passions are different. Our lives are unique. And the eyes we look through every moment are special to us. Don't ever assume that your bias is sacred. Every component of your bias is open to be challenged. Even your assumptions need to be kept in check. Reevaluate them on a regular basis. How about explaining components to the people you work with? And ask them to find the assumptions in your work. And remember, you are working for people. You're building a web for human beings with emotions. And you are serving them the web. Let's agree to make it a great experience for them. Thanks for listening to today's show again. I really appreciate the time that you take to listen to these episodes. I hope that you guys have learned something and that when you think about your bias, that it's not going to get in the way of building a better way. If you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. You can get me at Jon Daiello. I look forward to hearing from you.